Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Mehmet Darakçıoğlu. I'm the Assistant Dean for Global Programs here at Gallatin, and I have also been working with Gallatin's Urban Democracy Lab since the beginning of this school year. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's panel, Cities in Crisis, Past and Present. And our panel tonight will explore the links between the urban fiscal crisis of the later 20th century and the current crisis facing the cities today as they cope with funding the response to COVID-19. Indeed, like very important topic. And it will explore questions such as how structures of inequality built into city and state budgets, how past crises of capitalism and the austerity regimes that followed shape the conditions of current urban policy, politics, and culture, and what is the scope of action for creating new regimes of urban governance in the wake of a global pandemic. We do have a great lineup, and I will briefly introduce them. But before that, I should mention that if you have any questions, please write them down in the Q&A, and our moderator will pose those questions to the panel at the end of the event, at the end of the presentations. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers for tonight. Johanna Fernandez is an associate professor of history at Baruch College, CUNY, and author of The Young Lords, A Radical History, on the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. Her Freedom of Information lawsuit against the NYPD recovered the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, over 1 million NYPD surveillance files, including those of Malcolm X. She's a leading member of the movement to bring home Mumia Abu-Jamal and other political prisoners. Destin Jenkins is a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago. He is the co-editor of Histories of Black Capitalism and the author of Bonds of Inequality, Death and the Making of the American City, that is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press. Kim Phillips-Fein teaches 20th century US political history at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study and the History Department at NYU. She's the author of Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal, and Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and Rise of Austerity Politics. And we have Sarah Miller-Davenport, who is going to be the moderator for tonight. She's a senior lecturer in US history at the University of Sheffield and is currently a visiting fellow at the Urban Democracy Lab. She's the author of Gateway State, Hawaii, and the Cultural Transformation of American Empire, and is currently working on a project on the reinvention of New York as a global city in the late 20th century. And last but not least, we are going to be joined by Gianpaolo Baiocchi, who is the director of Urban Democracy Lab at Gallatin. He's a sociologist and ethnographer interested in questions of politics and culture, critical social theory, and cities. He has written about and continues to research instances of actual existing civic life and participatory democracy. And I should also mention that Gianpaolo, along with Jacob Carson, penned an op-ed today that came out of New York Times. So please check that out. It is entitled How to Fix Housing for Everyone Except Corporate Speculators. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Sarah. And again, please write down your questions in the Q&A section.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't see all of your faces, but I hear that we have over 100 people in the audience, which is amazing. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists for presenting their work tonight. And we're going to keep it relatively simple. I'll have just 2 rounds of questions for the panelists, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So I'll start with the first question, which is, hold on, let me get to it. Sorry, I have many tabs open. How is today's crisis facing cities, how is that informed by the longer history of urban crises? And why is it that it seems, global crises of capitalism have a particularly severe impact on cities. So I'll throw it to Destin first, and if you could take a stab at that, that would be excellent.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation. Greatly appreciate it. It's a great honor to be on this smoking panel here. Some scholars and historians who I really admire. I was tempted to kind of, when I thought about this question ahead of time, I was tempted to kind of think about the urban crisis of the late 1960s, or to think about the fiscal crises of the 1970s. But what I wanted to first kind of do is to ask and to probe the limits of the crisis narrative, and the limits of describing existing socio-political and economic conditions facing American cities as a crisis. So the first question to my mind I had to think about was, in what ways is this actually a crisis? Is it a projection of one? And what are the dominant metrics on which we rely to describe a conjuncture as such? And so just to kind of be clear here, what I don't want to do is just kind of say that we can substitute tragedy for crisis and frame this discussion, that we should lean on another framing device. Nor is it my intention to suggest that a crisis is all relative. That is to say, always an ongoing crisis for marginalized folks. I'm trained as a historian, so I have to kind of think about contingency and ruptures. And I think we are no doubt in a pivotal moment. The question to my mind is, what are the implications of uncritically relying on a crisis narrative and describing this moment as such? What are the implications of relying on a narrative arc which essentially moves out of darkness and into the light? What are the implications of reifying a creation or resurgence story? And for me, the question, of course, is the social scientist's question is, what counts as a crisis? But really, to my mind, the more essential question is, to what extent does a crisis narrative serve us well? That is, those interested and invested in building progressive social movements. To what extent does describing this moment as such serve that political end? And I'm tempted to think really and land on the point that ultimately the crisis framing ultimately serves the right far more than it does a progressive left vision. The mobilization of a romantic genre, the centering of a valiant hero, the villain that is identifiable and projected by a right-wing media ultimately means that framing this moment as a crisis might actually be a gift to the right in ironic ways. So I think behind the question, though, Sarah, is, in addition to just the kind of framing, is, are there historical analogs, parallels? And I had the great pleasure of being on a panel with Kim 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago, I don't remember when it was, where we kind of thought about the 1970s. And I ultimately thought that this moment reminded me of the late 1980s and early 1990s in particular. So just as some context, we could think about 1989, where David Jenkins, who eventually goes on to become the first Black mayor of New York City, beats Ed Koch in the Democratic primary and takes a slim victory over Rudolph Giuliani. He inherits a $1 billion deficit, upcoming negotiations with municipal employees, declining infrastructure and fixed escalating debt service payments. I'm happy to say more about that. And also at a moment of declining federal support for American cities. And so this is what he inherits. And at the same time, of course, you have the social crises of homelessness, fears about crime and so forth. And so Jenkins inherits that and quickly faces off against Giuliani, who takes advantage of the murder of Jose, I believe his name is Jose Kiko Garcia up in Washington Heights. And my colleague, Pedro Regalado, has written wonderfully about this. Takes advantage of this moment, this murder of this brother from Washington Heights, rallies the riotous NYPD, many off-duty officers outside of City Hall who storm the Brooklyn Bridge. And he rides this kind of racial revanchism all the way to Gracie Mansion. From there, though, of course, there's a lot in between. We get the sodomy of Abner Louima, the murder of Amadou Diallo, ramped up broken windows policing. And so my main point here is to think about the extent to which the crisis narrative actually is a gift for the right in framing this particular moment. And that's an especially important question to think through as we have mayoral elections in New York City this year, in Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Charlotte, Seattle, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so not just in New York City, but elsewhere, the ways in which the crisis narrative can get mobilized, and in particular, the ways in which white revanchism politics interacts with the grievance politics of the NYPD and local law enforcement, and ultimately framed around a budget crisis could ultimately lead to a victory for the right at the mayoral level. So anyway, that's a long way of just thinking about the crisis narrative framing before we make historical analogies to think about the work that it does and whether or not it serves us well.
Great, thank you, Destin. So next I will throw it to Kim with the same question. How can we understand today's crisis facing US cities, or maybe you want to use a different word other than crisis? How can we understand what's going on today as part of a longer history of urban crises or some other term of your choosing?
Yeah, well, thank you. I would just also say thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. And it's wonderful to be on the panel with Destin and Johanna and to be just to be here together. So I also have been, it's especially fun to do it after the one that we did a couple of weeks ago, which I've been thinking about ever since. So I actually, thinking about this question, I too was struck by the myriad different ways of thinking about crisis and the different kinds of crises that we have seen over the past year. Is this a crisis of public health? Is it a crisis of police violence? Is there a crisis of, is this a fiscal crisis with all the weight put on that interpretation and approach to city politics? When thinking about the idea of a crisis and whether crises they manifest in particular ways in cities, are they necessarily more severe there? So I too was thinking a bit about the language of crisis and whether there's reasons to be skeptical of it with its suggestion of exceptionality. Is the ordinary, everyday, another kind of crisis? And then yes, the narrative of crisis with its suggestion of tension and resolution, does that, how does that operate? Then finally, I was remembering, for whom is this a crisis? What kind of crisis is it? And I was recollecting at one point doing interviews for Fear City, talking to somebody who had been an activist, I think at Hostos Community College in the 70s, and I kind of brought up the idea of the fiscal crisis, the crisis, and she said, well, what crisis? It was really just, things weren't really so bad for us, or for me anyway, during the 70s. It was a time of victory and change. This wasn't a crisis. It was actually a positive moment in a lot of ways. So I too was kind of thinking about what is a crisis? How do we think about crisis? So that was the first set of things I would put out there. Second, though, I would say that this is, that there are ways, the idea of a fiscal crisis in particular refers to something, a distinct phenomenon, or the issue of cities, the question of whether cities or governments are able to raise sufficient revenue to cover their expenses, whatever those may be, including paying debt service. And I think the framework of fiscal crisis can be problematic here too. Once something is framed in terms of a fiscal crisis, the question often becomes, well, how do you resolve that crisis? The only thing to do is to balance the budget. That can typically lead to calls for different kinds of service cuts. Cities are, and city governments, I think, are uniquely prone to these kinds of crises. Cities obviously are limited in the kinds of tools that they can use to raise revenue. They are literally limited, as we are often reminded. New York City is a creature of the state. It can't really just decide to raise taxes in any way that it chooses. The property tax is the major tax that it can control directly. Other kinds of taxes rely on the state. So on one level, cities are actually limited in their ability to respond to budgetary pressures. At the same time, they're also, I think, economically limited. It is while, and we can talk about this more later, while the ability of wealthy people or even upper middle class people, their mobility can be exaggerated, it's more present, obviously, for a city than it is for a state, let alone for a country, for a federal government. So in some ways, there are kind of different layers of the state that have the capacity to tax, and cities are in many ways the weakest of these. This means that cities are actually uniquely prone to this type of fiscal shortfall, and that economic changes and other, there's something about city governments in particular, which makes them susceptible to this kind of dynamic. And then finally, I would say that cities are also politically, as units, because they are more closely connected to the citizenry in a way, it's possible to put pressure on them in ways that it's actually harder to pressure state or federal governments. And in this way too, they can become sites of mobilization in very distinctive ways, and struggles over city budgets can have particular dynamics because of that. So I think just very, very, very briefly, and then we'll move on. One of the questions that people have been asking a lot lately is New York facing another fiscal crisis similar to 1975? And this was often brought up over the course of the past year. We know that New York did experience a very sudden contraction in employment with the onset of the pandemic. The city has not recovered in terms of the lost jobs by any stretch. Walking around the city, one can see evidence of closed businesses and the like. And for much of last year, New York encountered a hostile, unsympathetic federal government, much as it did in the 70s. But that said, I do think it's actually important, and here maybe the language of crisis is not so helpful, at least fiscal crisis. The city's budget problems are not on the scale that they were in the 70s by any stretch of the imagination. And the city is just, the deficits that the city is facing are not as great. The level of organization in the comptroller's office and in the budget office is much greater now than it was then. And the resilience of the city's economy should also be greater in certain ways than in the 70s. So I think that this is an example of the language of crisis today can be used to make it harder to actually understand what's going on now and some of the issues that actually separate today from the past. I think I'll stop now, and we'll circle back to some of the other questions about New York in particular later on.
Great, thank you, Kim. And I certainly take both of your points, and Johanna might have the same point about the ways in which crisis, suggests that there's a resolution, or that it can be something that's in the past and can lead us to overlook the ways in which there are ongoing problems. Certainly, and to compare today's situation in New York to the situation in 1975 as the same kind of crisis, perhaps in a way overlooks some of it, ironically, some of the historical continuities that we see between the 70s and now, that are not necessarily framed as crises. But in any case, I will throw it now to Johanna.
Well, thank you so very much for the invitation, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here with Kim and Destin. And, we'll figure this out in 5 minutes or less. And I'm essentially going to think out loud here. But so I like that Kim has asked, well, what are we referring to? What crisis? Today, there's unemployment as a result of the pandemic, but there was an enormous crisis prior to the pandemic that we hadn't quite overcome since the recession of 2007, 2008. There's a health crisis for sure. New York took the biggest hit in terms of COVID deaths. There's a problem of education, housing, gentrification is displacing folks. New Yorkers can't really afford to live in New York. There's also a crisis of transportation. It's incredibly expensive. There's a deficit, and it doesn't function the way most New Yorkers would like it to. So that's a crisis for sure. I think it might actually help to call it a crisis that is insufferable and we must end it. And the question of resolution is tied to priorities. What does the city prioritize? And is the city a place for the residents and working class people of New York or Chicago or Philadelphia, or is the city essentially the playground of capital? There is a crisis because, and that crisis is racialized, and the pandemic pretty much painted a picture of how it is racialized, right? It's predominantly a Black American and Latino working class that took the subway. It's a predominantly Black American and Latino working class that lives in cramped housing conditions that got COVID. And it's a predominantly Black American and Latino working class that's essential to the life of the city and that had access to hospitals unequipped to deal with any kind of elementary health problem, let alone a pandemic. So the crisis is racialized and it's economic. I think that when we talk about the urban crisis, we must talk about its history. Sociologists talked about it in the 1980s. It was associated with the crack epidemic, with crime, with welfare dependency. There was a racialized critique, or a racist, a racist critique of the problems of the city that came to be known as the urban crisis. But for historians, the urban crisis of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s had an origin point, and that's World War II and the post-war period in urban centers. What do we see happening? That Black Americans and Latinos, who are generally, before World War II, are rural people, not on the whole, but a huge percentage of racialized people are rural people tied to the land, sharecroppers, rural people in Puerto Rico. These people, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, Native Americans, become proletarianized on a mass scale as a result of World War II. And there's a migration from countryside to city. There had been migrations of Black Americans previously, but this was the mother of migrations, which ultimately leads to the rise of the civil rights movement. But this demographic of racialized people, previously rural, who are now proletarianized, are entering the city at a moment when factories are moving out of the cities and into the suburbs in stages in pursuit of lower production costs. So precisely at the moment when people of color, racialized people, are becoming part of the working class, they're entering an economy in decline, right? Here's the urban crisis. And so that population does not have access to the jobs that previous migrants had access to, say, in the late 19th century, when European migrants entered a rising, strong American economy when American capital was strong. That doesn't mean that they didn't face exploitation and oppression, but they entered the economy at a moment when the economy was emergent. People of color are entering the economy en masse when the urban industrial economy is on the decline. And we see for the first time ever in the history of the city, the emergence of permanent unemployment, right, in the 1960s. The Bureau of Labor Statistics for the first time begins to track this crisis in the cities, which is that young people are permanently out of the labor market because they can't find jobs, a product of deindustrialization. We tend to think of deindustrialization as a white working class problem, but before deindustrialization became a white working class problem, it was a Black American working class problem in the city and a Puerto Rican working class problem in New York, Chicago, a Mexican American working class problem. And of course, alongside of that, we have the out-migration of white workers from the city to the suburbs and the white middle class. So we have a racialized economic problem that is the product of government policy that creates suburbanization and allows a section of the population to the suburbs. It helps pretty much, there's a bloodletting of the economic tax base of the city, right? The population of the city decreases exponentially. And the people who are left behind are still part of the working class, are still helping the city stay afloat, but in the context of an ailing economy. And the government essentially, and I'm gonna end here, the government addresses these crises of the tax base erosion, the crisis of joblessness within a section of the urban population with repression, with policing, with draconian laws that bring us mass incarceration and Amadou Diallo and Abner Louima and Anthony Baez. These were all the people who were killed in the 1990s, and there were more. So there's just one linchpin here. So in this 1980s and 90s, the urban crisis is responded to with draconian repressive policies of incarceration. And now we have an aging population in prisons who got 40-year sentences and life in prison without parole for essentially selling marijuana, which is now the great American business. And these people are getting COVID and dying in prison today. So, I mean, and on top of that, we've got new generations of young people, people of color in the city who are on the front lines as essential workers and who can barely pay their rent in New York City because this city belongs to the ruling class. And ultimately, what we have is a crisis of priorities under capitalism. It's a crisis that is organized around profit and driven by the profit motive, where the needs of human beings are asked to take a hike. That's what I got for you.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And I think all of us historians here and many non-historians, I think, appreciate taking us back to World War II and to show that, you know, even when we talk about something like the 1975 fiscal crisis, which seems so acute, you know, it has a much longer history to it, as does the current situation in cities today. So I want to give our panelists a chance to respond to each other before we move on to our next round. So I know Destin wants to.
Yeah, I had a question, John, and that was just masterful narration, and the fact that you did it off the top of the dome was impressive. I had a question though about so there's one thing about like the historical arc, and no doubt there's an actual crisis. I like what you said, a crisis of priorities, the sort of insufferable conditions of so many folks in New York City and elsewhere. I guess my question though is like, what do you think that crisis? To ask a little bit more about the work that crisis does as a narrative framing device in the way of base building and mobilization. As I say, it's one thing to sort of frame the structural origins of where we're at today as a crisis, the urban crisis, a fiscal crisis. And I'm just curious about like, and you know, you've done this work, the ways in which you can mobilize crisis as a narrative device, as a framing device. Do you think it does work to alert people to the, as you mentioned, the New York City as a playground of capital, to alert people to various structural issues? Or do you think that there are pitfalls and consequences of framing where we're at today in terms of a crisis in the way of demobilization or some other kind of mobilization, for instance, on the right? So that's really just a, you know, one, I'm kind of clarifying what I meant. I mean, I don't want to sort of flippantly dismiss the lived conditions and really the violence, really, and a tragic violence against so many folks. Really, I'm trying to think about what work it does in terms of mobilization. So I'm just curious, given that you've done that kind of work, and if you could reflect a bit more about the political uses of crisis in the way of mobilization.
Should I answer now? Okay, so this is the thing. I hear where you're going. I hear where you're getting at, which is that this notion of the urban crisis was mobilized by Democrats and Republicans, not the right, to essentially scapegoat welfare mothers, Black welfare mothers, welfare queens, remember those words? To scapegoat immigrants and no count Black folk, criminal Black folk for the problems of American society. Absolutely. It wasn't Republicans who brought us mass incarceration. It was Bill Clinton, right? And the crime bill. The crime bill was signed, the crime bill and the welfare reform bill were signed under a Democratic Party that actually ushered those bills in. And of course, that was a Democratic Party that had moved to the right. So I see what you're saying, that this crisis language is used for toward repressive ends. And it's a racialized one that doesn't really point to structural roots of social problems, and that essentially plays the blame game. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the folks who were organizing in the cities in the 1960s. They used the language of a fascism, of a creeping fascism, the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. They actually identified white reaction and its Nixonian, draconian, carceral, COINTELPRO homicidal character as fascist, and they were not wrong. We can say that now. Like, as a graduate student at Columbia in the 1990s, people would have been like, you crazy. You crazy. You as crazy as them. But in fact, we see clearly that Trump is a consolidation of white wing, of white reaction, of white nationalist reaction to the struggles of the civil rights and Black power movements. It's a consolidation of that ideology, of the logic. But what I wanted to say is that 60s radicals and 60s activists were trying to say, folks, the city is no longer for us. The house is burning and they no longer need us. We're a redundant class. Automation has taken over and nobody cares about us, and they're deploying armies against us. That's the language of crisis, if ever there was language of crisis. But the radicals had control of the narrative, right? So they used that crisis language, which was accurate, to marshal forces toward a reorganization of society. We need breakfast for children. We need decent health care. The Young Lords are responsible, alongside of doctors at Lincoln Hospital, Kim's mother in particular. They drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights. And they said, there's a healthcare crisis and it's homicidal. And we have to establish different morals and standards and ethics around health and how people are treated. So yes, I want more people to think that there's a crisis and that the building is burning and we need to do something now. The question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to put people in prison, or are we going to build more hospitals? Because right now in New York City, that in the last 5 years, they've gotten rid of hospital beds. In Brooklyn, there's a hospital that's shut down during the pandemic. So that's a crisis. I think we need to address the crisis from the left with humanity and an ethic that amplifies human need, and that's compassionate. Like, there's something called hopefully compassion, the growth of compassion under COVID. Like, hopefully we've grown a heart amidst when coming to face with mortality.
Thank you, Johanna. And I think, yeah, certainly the word crisis, it sort of depends who's wielding it and to what ends. So I'm going to now throw it back to Kim to respond to any of the other panelists and what they've said so far.
Yeah, I think, thank you both for those wonderful comments. And I think actually, and Johanna, also thank you for mentioning my mother and her work at Lincoln. And yeah, I think that I guess I would just add that, partly this comes from, I agree with, I think both of you, both that the framework of the urban crisis is often one that, and also the fiscal crisis is one that foregrounds can foreground a more conservative approach, but the language of emergency and emotional and moral urgency that you're talking about is also, brought up by and the sense of rupture and possibility that the language of crisis holds within itself. And there is a kind of radical potential there and something worth holding on to. And I think actually this was very last March or a year ago when the pandemic arrived in New York, and at the beginning of the shutdowns, I think for many people, myself included, there was a sense of kind of a disorienting sense, but one that also seemed to hold certain kinds of possibility, that the way that we had been doing things wasn't the way they just had to go on forever. It was actually possible for things to suddenly and radically change. And in this case, in a kind of nightmarish and frightening way, but even still, that had some sense of the just you could hold everything up and look at it differently and start in a different direction. Now, of course, that's also always, that's never true. Nothing ever breaks fully from the past. So, but somehow both things are true at once.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. So before I launch into our next question for the panelists, I just want to let the audience know to please use the Q&A feature for when we do open it up to audience Q&A. So if you have any burning questions that have come up so far, please ask them in the Q&A. So next I want to get your opinion on how can we use a historical analysis of past urban crises or whatever you want to call them to inform cities' response to the current crisis. This is not necessarily meant to be a kind of schematic lessons of history framework, but a kind of thinking about a sort of usable past or how we can, as historians, help to explain what's going on today to affect potentially positive change. This has certainly been touched on so far, but I would love if you all could elaborate on that. So I think I'm throwing it to Kim first for this one. So if you could jump in, and then we will move on. Great.
Well, this is maybe a narrower approach to the question, but just thinking about it, so, I mean, I think this has certainly come up, the question of what can we learn specifically from the 70s has come up a good deal this past year. And I think, so I'll maybe just speak to that and open it, let you guys open it up more. In my initial remarks, I spoke briefly about some of the differences between now and the 70s, that despite the potential parallels, the fiscal and budgetary aspects of the crisis are not actually as severe as they were then. And I think another dimension of this is that the politics around the crisis moment are also themselves rather different. That in the 70s, New York was very quickly singled out and blamed for the problems that unfolded within it. And I think that it's much harder to do that now. You can see the Republican Party to some extent trying to claim that blue states are the ones that are going to be having these severe problems, but it's not clear, for one thing, that the fiscal shortfalls for any states are going to be as serious as people had thought that they might be. And for cities, it's just not, it appears, even if for states, things may not be as serious as people had anticipated, at least in terms of fiscal politics. For cities, it simply isn't the situation. What's happened is really a hit to revenue. It is not about cities spending too much or too lavishly. So first of all, I think any effort to frame the crisis in terms of, any effort to frame fiscal crises that emerge out of this in terms of cities spending too much, too generously, should be vigorously and intensely resisted. I just don't think that empirically, it's not clear that this is just a different type of crisis. And it's not, whatever way you could frame the fiscal crisis 70s in that rhetoric or that analysis. And even then it was much too simple and only a part of the story. This is just not the same. And so it should be pushed back against as hard as possible. Second, I think that the answer to the fiscal crises of the 70s was to cut social spending, to cut education, to close hospitals, to close health clinics, to end drug treatment programs, to not fund daycare as generously, to lay people off. And I think that also we could see in the late 70s in New York, that actually exacerbated many of the fiscal, even the narrow fiscal problems of the city, let alone the broader human and social cost. There's been a certain amount of rhetoric today about either the super rich leaving New York if taxes are raised, or the more generally a sense of anxiety about white flight, or would the upper middle classes all go to Massachusetts or something, or to Florida? Here too, there just really isn't the evidence that that has been happening or will happen. And insofar as it is a danger, I think it would have much more to do with cuts to the public sector and to the, to schools and the public functions of the city than it would taxes. So again, that, one of the lessons of the 70s, I think, is really that it's actually very dangerous for cities to engage in intense across the board budget cuts, and can really exacerbate both the narrow fiscal problems as well as the, making the city much more difficult for middle class, working class, poor people to live in. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Kim. Johanna, I'm going to throw it to you next.
Sorry. As I'm listening to Kim itemize the response to the fiscal crisis, by the way, when historians talk about crisis, there's a difference between the fiscal crisis and the urban crisis. So I really organized my talk around the urban crisis, not the fiscal crisis, because that was the language used. But the fiscal crisis is just another animal connected to the urban crisis. But as you're talking, Kim, what you are outlining, and we know this, but it's good to review, the laboratory wherein neoliberalism emerges right here in New York City as a response to the fiscal crisis, and a language is used of dependency and debauchery in New York that needs to be reeled in, and we need to slim it down. We need to punish it to save it. Just food for thought, right? And it's a very racialized program of starving the city in order to save it, which is what the language that was used in Vietnam. we needed to, what was it again? We needed to kill the city to save it. Right. Lord Jesus, I teach this, but I can't remember now. Okay. So I think that unless there is a movement that is going to avert that fate, that's where we're headed. Brookhaven is I think is the hospital that is being shut down right now. Like it was dismembered during the pandemic. Hospital doctors literally marching. You don't often see today's hospital doctors marching and speaking out and crying, and nurses and respiratory technicians talking about how this hospital saved lives at the height of the pandemic, and it was dismembered. So I think that that's where we're headed. There's a freeze right now in the CUNY system in terms of hiring. Their budget cuts up the wazoo. In the context of economic fiscal crisis, the ruling class is not going to pay. It's working class people who are going to pay with education, with the hospitals, with services. And so the only thing that can stop that is pressure from below. I mean, that's what history shows. People at the top of society are not handing out hotcakes. They're not handing out checks. The checks that were handed out recently were handed out to save capitalism, in fact. So I think that what we can learn from the past is that only an organized strategic movement of working class people reorganizing the priorities of this city through protest will avert the crisis as it is deployed against the working class. I just want to say one thing about a question we didn't address, which is why is the broader crisis of capitalism likely to impact cities in particular? Very quickly, I think it's important to take a step back and talk about the origins of capitalism. First of all, capitalism emerges in the city. But what capitalism necessitates in order to emerge is the elimination of the commons. Peasants were forced out of their rural dwellings and their lands because the collectively owned lands that help them survive from season to season, known as the commons, were literally obliterated by emerging capitalism. It took the commons 100 years to be destroyed in Europe. In places like Vietnam and in the colonized world, the Europeans eliminated the commons. They were called the village lands in Vietnam in 10 years. An enormous amount of violence that forced peasants to send their children to the cities to get jobs that were paid in dollars so they could pay the tax that was now being imposed in cash. So the essence of capitalism is land displacement. That's just part of its DNA. And so this is what we see. Decade in, decade out. Lincoln Center, the land on which Lincoln Center was built was a Puerto Rican neighborhood that housed 22,000 families, a vibrant neighborhood known for outdoor music. And that was raised in order to build Lincoln Center. So the Bronx is no longer burning. It's the site of gentrification. It's the new frontier. So real estate is the linchpin, especially of American settler capitalism. And one of the crises that we see devastating people's lives in the cities is not just employment, but where do we live, and can we afford it? Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think on the point of historical lessons, the first is one of the things that's not mentioned enough is, and this is the great work of Matthew Vaz, has a new book out called Running the Numbers. One of the things he notes is how in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, one of the responses, the major response of states to the budget squeeze is to effectively absorb illegal gambling and the numbers running that had been populated and activated by Black communities in Chicago and Harlem, Cleveland, and elsewhere, is that the state effectively absorbs that way of revenue generation for itself. It pledges, at least in New York, to use those funds for public education, but all kinds of budget chicanery happens and that money is used elsewhere. So that is so for instance, in Illinois, once the state legalizes gambling, it raises $42 million in 1980. By 1982, it raises over $250 million. And at the same time, for instance, in New York, you have people like Mayor Ed Koch start to actually, he lifts the moratorium on arrests for low-level offenses related to gambling. So one of the things we can kind of think about potentially is the ways in which the state, New York State, for instance, or other states absorb so-called illegal informal activities and also turns up the acts of criminalization for folks who were engaged in those former illegal activities, all in pursuit of revenues, which is Kim's point about the revenue squeeze, right? How are cities going to engage in revenue generation? There's the regressive model, fees, fines, taxes, regressive taxes, there's absorption, and then of course there's the progressive model, which is, for instance, ending tax subsidies for Madison Square Garden. So that's one kind of battle that we have before us, but I want us to think a bit more about absorption. And the other example is just right, like, so cities struggle with fixed debt service payments, interest rates are low at this point, but one opportunity, and it's an odd one to cite here, is how you have these reactionary racist Southerners in the late 1920s who are dealing with odious debts and a harmed credit reputation from the overthrow and repudiation of debts incurred during early Reconstruction. They overthrow, repudiate those debts in the 1870s. And then by the late 1920s, early 1930s, they're calling on the federal government to effectively absorb, bail them out by way of making bondholders whole so that they can have a blank slate. That's an odd example to cite, right? To go back to racist reactionaries who are placing their debt relief on the footsteps of the federal government. But the federal government in this moment, in addition to grants to municipalities so that they avoid the trap of borrowing during a moment of low interest rates. In addition to grants to localities, there also is the chance to absorb, take on the debts of localities so that they're not burdened by by fixed interest payments. Because that's the other point, right? There was a question about how budgets actually, how inequality is structured in city budgets. One of the things we know is the sanctified promise to bondholders and the tenuous promise to other city residents, if you even would call it a promise to municipal employees, for instance. So given that promise is sanctified, is sacrosanct, it is left, it is never discussed and debated why it is those fixed debt service payments are always made in June and December of every year, semi-annual interest payments. That's off the table as a thing to tinker with, as a way of freeing up space for municipalities. Well, since that's off the table, then the federal government can absorb some of those municipal debts to allow cities to use diminished revenues elsewhere towards progressive ends. And that, of course, exists in tandem with the divest and invest, which is really about budget allocation, pulling funds from police and investing in local services. So anyway, that's an odd example of absorption, to go back to reactionaries, but it's one that in the end might provide cities some relief.
Thank you, Destin. Before we throw it to the audience, I want to get your assessment on, we talked about this at this moment as a crisis or whatever you want to call it, and the ways in which crisis has been mobilized for regressive purposes. And Johanna's arguing that we need to mobilize this moment, in a progressive or leftist direction. So and I know as a historian, I don't love to make predictions, but I'm going to ask you guys to make predictions nonetheless. I mean, what is your sense of this moment as one that can be used to, create new priorities, create new municipal priorities? I'll throw it to Kim first, since she brought that up.
Right. Well, it'll be very interesting to see how things play out in New York over the course of the next year leading up to the mayoral election. And so far, it's a little hard to tell, I think, how all this will resonate there. I have been struck, though, that by the strength of the tax the rich mobilization. So for people who haven't heard about this, there is right now a kind of a broad program which is directed at Albany. It's not really at the city level, but which proposes a variety of different ways to generate revenue for the state through taxes on upper income people, and not just an income tax, but a financial services tax, a form of a heirs tax on inheritances, a pied-à-terre tax. So it's a variety of different kinds of taxes, a call to rethink and reassess property taxes. So it's a kind of asking people to think more generally about how taxes are raised in the state and how that might filter down to the city. And I think it's very much against the backdrop of the reality of the last year, that poor people, Black and Latinx people, bore the brunt of the impact of the pandemic in terms of sickness and death, and the as well as the economic burdens of it. And while the elite in New York was able to become far more wealthy, in part because of the insane performance of the stock market over the last year. And I think that kind of hovers in the backdrop of this discussion about budget. It gives a certain kind of, it just highlights the absurdity of cutting public services at this moment, at this particular moment in time. And, just really literally making evident the violence behind that and the need to develop a different approach. So who knows what will happen? And obviously the last week has been a week of crisis in Albany as well, a more personal type of crisis for Governor Cuomo. So, but I think that I've been impressed and interested by the way that this, agenda, which previously had been really quite off the table in New York. And even last year, the city, when it was worried about a budget shortfall, was insisting that the only real solution was debt and, finding a way to expand its borrowing authority. Now, so things are changing quickly. And I think it is a time of possibility, and we'll see, how things play out over the year ahead.
Johanna, do you want to take a stab at that?
So the question is to what, we have a ball. What are those balls called? The glass.
Crystal ball.
The what?
The crystal ball.
The crystal ball. We have a crystal ball. We were taught as historians to never reach into the crystal ball. You just don't do that. But I think that, I wish Josh Freeman were part of this conversation, because his book, Working Class New York, which has an anniversary, I think, this year, and he's retiring, and there's a conference organized around his work, and that book in particular is about the role of the working class in New York, which has a tremendous amount of power. And we got a sense of that just in the last month when the Hunts Point workers went out on strike. And it galvanized the city. Like, people were dancing in the streets who are not from New York, from the Bronx. So in support of the Hunts Point market workers, who were asking for better healthcare benefits. And an increase of, I think, $1.50 an hour or $1 an hour. So I think there is an uptick in labor activity. Laundry workers, not sure if you know that the wash supply workers at the laundromat on 79th Street in Amsterdam protested infernal conditions at the laundromat, not unlike those of the shirtwaist factory fire, literally. They voted for a union, and the shop just closed down last week entirely. violently, took all of the machines out. But those women are out there, immigrant women, they're protesting, I think on Saturday, they protested last Saturday, and they actually marched to the site of the fire, of the Triangle Waste Factory fire. Transit workers are angry. A huge number of transit workers lost their lives to COVID. And teachers are on fire and angry about their utter and complete lack of control over the workplace during the COVID season, and their disrespect, the ways in which the city and the mayor disrespected them. So I think that we need to look to the people who make the city run, essential workers. I hear that the delivery guys, disproportionately men, who deliver our food, they're in the process of organizing a union. Ultimately, that's the alternate site of power, right? And once upon a time, New York was New York because labor flexed its muscle. And you know, we got a sense of that when nurses and doctors flexed their muscle during the pandemic and said, you know, who are we as a city? We're better than this. So there are two classes. There are two classes in the world: those who own and control the means of production and their managers, and those who produce the goods and services. And they have different interests. And the question is, will the working class, which is a complex one in 21st century New York and the 21st century city, it includes, you know, geeks, computer geeks. Are these people gonna say, you know, we need to live by a different ethic that prioritizes our health, the environment, the water, how our kids learn, how hospitals care for us. You know, it's not that difficult, but the left in this country has been demobilized by McCarthyism and repression, and we need to revitalize these ideas. And there is an uptick. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there is an uptick in labor organizing, protests, and noises around unionization. Why? Because the folks who didn't lose their jobs during the pandemic were disproportionately union workers. So in my magic ball, what's it called again? Glass ball? Crystal ball. Crystal ball, you know, they're suffering, and it seems like Amazon workers in Bessemer, if those people win, I think that people need a model to follow and confidence. And there have been defeats after defeat after defeat, although according to a new study, Black Lives Matter protests suppressed the homicidal activity of cops wherever they happen. You read about that study just off the press. So it will, I predict that if the Bessemer workers win, the Amazon workers, that's going to be a game changer. If they lose, we're going to have to carry water for a minute.
I guess I wanted to just simply add that there's like a big question that is animating the movement for Black Lives, People's Budget LA. I mean, you can go on and on. Really, the question is, where's the bag? Where are the funds going to come from? And what Kim highlighted was the tax the rich mobilization at the state level. And then you can also think about, again, deeper engagement with municipal budgets. Why so much spending on policing and not on X, Y, and Z? And so I don't know the longer arc, but it would be interesting to think about a broader 20th century history of people's engagement with matters of municipal finance. Because it seems to me that we're at a particular moment where it's not just sloganeering, but actually deep diving into the numbers, reading the budgets, and using the budgets to make claims on the state. And so that to me seems to me really kind of is a reason for optimism. I'm also thinking about this moment. A few weeks ago, we were on a panel and Ronnie Lowenstein, who was with the New York City Independent Budgets Office, highlighted the point of more or less thinking about, well, she didn't describe it in these ways, let me be clear, but more or less thinking about the threat of virtual work, which we could describe as a form of a corporate stick up, right? We'll leave if we don't get what we want. We've seen that play out time and time again. The only institutions who can't really do that are universities, which are place-based. And so I'm reminded of Devarian Baldwin's new work, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower. And one of his calls, his appeals, is to increase payments in lieu of taxes. Now, there's an argument to be made about whether these universities, private universities in particular, should be tax exempt. Given the composition of the Supreme Court, I doubt very much that the Supreme Court would weigh in and undermine the tax exempt status of private institutions, especially if it, for instance, affects an institution like Notre Dame. So given that that is off the table, or to the extent that it is off the table, local groups can make greater claims on universities to make even greater payments in lieu of taxes pilots. And that can bring together students, faculty, staff, community members to demand that these institutions, which for instance in Boston, universities make up how much of the landmass, which is effectively taken off the property tax rolls. That's funds that cannot go to other services, should pay more, should do more. These are billion-dollar institutions. That's where the bag is. And so I'm really kind of encouraged at this moment that because people are doing a deeper dive into matters of finance, deeper dive into budgets, endowments, that there's a chance to kind of make claims on institutions. We know that the universities won't respond. Sure, we'll abide by it, but pressure a campaign around pilots that brings together university affiliates and the community, to me, is a reason why I'm a bit more optimistic, because if you can find that money, then in addition to the divest stuff, right, pulling from police budgets, you can build out a more robust public sector, more public services than we certainly have had over the last 50 years. And to do so in particular in racially just ways. I don't buy the narrative that, since the 70s, things became far less equal, became more racialized. We know from the very beginning, the public was racialized. And so when we talk about trying to make claims on the state, to use funding to reinvest in the public, to make sure it's along anti-racist lines. And I'm somewhat optimistic about that, even if in addition to our disciplinary training insisting that we don't make predictions, we also are often assuaged and told to sort of be pessimists. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and I guess that's because I'm a man of faith.
Thank you. Kim, I'm reminded in your book, you talk about kind of municipal budgets as like moral documents, and that they reflect the moral economy of the city, right? And that so that in the case of ending free tuition at CUNY, for instance, right, like it didn't make a huge difference to the municipal budget, right, but it sent a particular message. And I think it seems to me that especially when we talk about with the defund the police movement, right, that I think there's a kind of broader awareness of the ways in which municipal budgets really are these kind of moral documents and a reflection of priorities. So we do have one question that is related to that, related to Black Lives Matter and the abolitionist movement, which is, essentially, this is from Scott. I'm not sure if he's still in the audience, but essentially, kind of, what do we do with the police themselves, who are responsible for killing or brutalizing members of the public, and this is, I guess, slightly going in a different direction, but how do, since we have you all here, and I'm sure you've thought about this, how do we, and I've seen this a lot, right, in kind of discussions about abolitionism, right? What do we do with the police? Should they also be kind of allowed to be part of sort of, the abolitionist movement? Does that apply to them? So I don't know who wants to answer that, but I'm throwing that out there since it was a question from the audience.
I can answer that question.
Great.
I'm sure others can answer it too, but I want to go back to the question of budgets, because I think the question of budgets is ultimately, we've seen, it's a moral one. Like it's almost like were you awake when we gave Wall Street trillions of dollars, like $3 trillion? Was it 3 trillion? 3 trillion. Who the hell knew that much money existed? Oh, yeah, let's give it away. So this is a question of priorities, right? It's a question of the moral core center of the city. And the question is, how do you shift the moral priorities and core of the city? As soon as American cities went up in flames in the 1960s, when riots swept through the country like a hurricane, all kinds of money showed up. I don't know where I don't know. You guys are the numbers people. But it happened. It's like magic. And here it is. That's what happened. Who was the mayor here in New York City? I interviewed Barry Goderer, the mayor's man. What was his name, guys? Jesus, it's all over my book, but I can't remember his name. The New York's mayor.
Lindsay.
Interviewed Barry Goderer. He was like, we were literally walking around with bags of money, and the money showed up because there was the threat of rebellion, and he called it, of course, riot money. We had riot money to go around. So it's not an end game. It's not like a pie that's fixed. It's more of, what do we need right now to ensure the status quo? And if our side makes enough noise, the money will materialize. Like it materialized for Wall Street. And the statistic is that billionaires increased their wealth by 1/3 in the last year in the United States, and cities like New York by 1/3. The cops, the power of the cops has been legion in the United States historically, but it increased exponentially and their power after the civil rights and Black Power movements. And that came with an ideological message that the cops can do no wrong, that their lives matter more than everyone else's. And so it's going to take a minute to deprogram American society, even people of color, from that ideology. And the reason why social movements are important is because they shift the terms of debate through creating crisis in the streets. They shift the moral compass of the conversation and its framework. So we are going to need an enormous amount of struggle and stopping the operation of the city around this issue of the police. We know that the police stop a crime in progress once every 400 years. Literally, that's the statistic. The cops don't solve crime at all. We don't really need them, honestly. We need social workers. We need more EMT people to intervene in moments of crisis. But the cops literally their function is not about stopping problems in the streets. And that's a conversation that we're going to have over and over again. Yeah, and we need to talk about alternatives to the police. Like, this is a way of reorganizing the budget of the city and employing a lot more people. We need more social workers and more community counselors disconnected from the repressive apparatus of the state and the police to solve problems in our communities. That's a New Deal program right there in terms of jobs. It's a conversation that requires political education. There's a struggle over ideas in society combined with protest to convince Americans to stop it with the police. Like, we're the only country in the world that solves social problems by sending the cops after them. I mean, it's barbaric.
Destin, do you want to jump in here?
I think
We have
Johanna,
just 3
I think
minutes
she
left.
got it. I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, no, I don't know if there's anything to add.
That was
so.
powerful, and ending with barbarism, I think is a good note.
All right. Well, I think we are basically at time, and I think that's probably a great place to end. I do wonder, for some reason I was thinking back to kind of World War II and this idea that, there was all this kind of pent up consumer demand during World War II. And I thought about that with COVID too, but I'm also now starting to think, there's a lot of pent up social demand that once, hopefully, when people are able to circulate and socialize a bit more, that, that pent up social demand will find its way into protests that maybe can lead to progressive change. So I just want to say thank you again so much to our panelists, to Destin, Kim, and Johanna, and follow there. We have a couple of other events coming up at the Urban Democracy Lab, so check out the website for those, and RSVP, and that's it. So thank you so much, and good night.